Chelsea. This is my channel, The Fancy Hat Lady Reads. I'm wearing one of my fancy booktube hats, and today I'm bringing you the second part of my May wrap-up. I did a first part of my May wrap-up that was the last video I posted. I'll link that for you in case you want to check that out. I talked about 5 books in that wrap-up. This is going to be the other 4. I didn't participate in any readathons or anything in the month of May that would have allowed me to break up my wrap-up like I kind of often end up doing for the month. So this is what I decided to do so that it wouldn't overwhelm me and so that I could give each of these books their fair amount of time. So 4 books today, but there are some really interesting ones here. The first is going to be The Snow Child by Eowyn Ivey. I think I ended up being a little disappointed in this, perhaps because I was just expecting a lot out of it and it didn't quite live up to expectations for me. I don't think there's anything wrong with this book though, and this is definitely one that I would recommend to a decent amount of people. So this is a historical fiction novel with some questionably fantastical fairy tale elements. Sometimes this sort of thing gets called magical realism. I don't feel that this is precisely what magical realism means. I don't know if there's any real agreed upon definition of what makes something magical realism or not, but the things that I've read that have really felt like it are things where no one asks, like, is this thing that's happening magical or is it not magical? I feel like in actual magical realism, fantastical things happen and are just accepted. And a decent amount of this book is preoccupied with the fact that at least one of the characters is actively wondering if what's going on is magical and if it is in fact a reenactment of a fairy tale that she remembers from her childhood. This is a fairy tale retelling because events in this book do mimic and echo those of a Russian fairy tale, sometimes translated as Snow Child, more often I think translated as The Snow Maiden. I often wonder when I go into a book that I know is a retelling of a fairy tale I'm not familiar with if I need to read the fairy tale first, or on the other hand if reading the fairy tale first will spoil the book for me in some way if the author is assuming you don't know it. I will tell you that it doesn't matter one way or the other for this book because the fairy tale itself is told and explained within the context of the story, as well as some of the variations and history of that fairy tale and different ways it can end. So this follows a couple who are homesteaders in Alaska in the 1920s. The wife is Mabel, the husband is Jack. They have been unable to have children even though they wanted them. And this has been sort of really psychologically traumatizing, especially it seems to Mabel. At the beginning of the book, things aren't going well for them on their homestead. They've come up to Alaska in order to get away from some of the family social pressure that was making Mabel really unhappy. She's been hoping for this clean start in this new place where she and Jack can forge a new life together. But they are facing serious setbacks with the farm and things are looking grim for the winter. And then into their life comes a young girl named Faina who starts hanging around their house after the two of them one evening built a snow child in the yard. Over time, Mabel becomes convinced that the girl is magical, that she is the snow child from this picture book that she remembers from her childhood. Jack, on the other hand, uncovers a less magical explanation for where she's come from and who she is and what her story is, but it never quite satisfactorily explains everything about her. This book takes place over a period of several years, during which Faina appears with the first snow of winter and then leaves in the spring, as Mabel and Jack come to think of her increasingly as their own child. In spite of the fact that she's kind of feral and maybe can't or shouldn't be completely confined to the ways of human society. So as I said, I don't think this book is bad. I don't think there's anything wrong with it. I just found about like the first 2/3 of it to be really slow going for me. And then towards the end, there's a jump in the chronology of a few years. And then that portion of the book really picked up for me. But it didn't totally win me over, and I gave this a 3-star rating. Next we have something totally different, and that is Dragonbreath Attack of the Ninja Frogs by Ursula Vernon. This is the second book in her kids' Dragonbreath series, this kind of half graphic novel, half normal text. And I don't think these are exactly the kind of books that you're going to be all that interested in unless you have a kid in your life to give them to. I am giving these to my 10-year-old cousin, and I'm reading them because I like Ursula Vernon and I want to read them first. This series is about a little dragon boy named Danny Dragonbreath, who's the only mythical creature in his school of amphibians and reptiles, and his series of adventures with his nerdy iguana friend Wendell. Reading the second book, I'm starting to see the sort of like repetitive groove that the series is getting into, and I'm expecting some of these patterns to continue as the series progresses. Something happens that instigates the adventure. Danny drags his friends with him on a bus that always ends up at a final bus stop somewhere magical and impossible. They have their adventure and then they get back on the bus home where no one's going to believe that they actually went to, in this case, mythical Japan. In this book, Wendell makes a friend who is Gasp, a girl named Suki. She is from Japan, but real Japan, not mythical Japan, so she is completely perplexed, of course, when she is attacked by ninja frogs. Meanwhile, Danny has been really into ninja movies and has developed some unrealistic expectations about how cool and awesome it would be to be a ninja. It's kind of fun to see Ursula Vernon poking a little bit of fun at things like misconceptions of Eastern cultures, with Suki there to shut them down, and misconceptions about what sorts of things little girls might be interested in. Suki reads the same action comics as Danny and Wendell, it turns out, so she's also there to shut that down. In fact, I really liked Suki, and I was sort of sad that at the end of the book it turns out that she goes back to Japan, because I was hoping that she would be in further installments. Maybe she'll come back at some point in the series, I don't know. But ultimately, while it's cute, these are the sorts of books where they're not super exciting just to read for themselves as an adult, unless you're like a hardcore Ursula Vernon fan. But yeah, I give it 3 stars. Okay, so the third book that I'm going to talk about is one that I got from the library that's already gone back, and that is A Closed and Common Orbit by Becky Chambers. This is the second of her Wayfarers books. It is a loose companion novel slash sequel to The Long Way to a Small Angry Planet. I think you can read this without reading The Long Way to a Small Angry Planet first. It makes sense on its own, but it does spoil some things about the end of that first book, and it isn't necessarily as good an introduction to this sci-fi world as a whole. So if for some reason you knew that you didn't want to read Long Way to a Small Angry Planet, there's no reason you couldn't pick up this book, but I would recommend reading these books in order. I'm going to try to frame my description of this book, though, so in a way that it won't be spoilery for Long Way to a Small Angry Planet. Basically, what we have here is a double character study of 2 characters. Pepper, who is a tech genius who we meet in the first book. She's a friend of one of the main characters of the first book. And an AI named Cedra. The 2 stories take place in different timelines, but they end up coming together for one culminating conclusion. The storyline that takes place after the events of The Long Way to a Small Angry Planet is Cedra's. She is an AI who has recently come into conscious existence, and she has been transferred into a body kit, which is a humanoid housing for an AI that can pass as human. This is illegal in this world, so she has to hide what she is, even though it's very unnatural for her to experience the world like a human does. She's been taken in by Pepper and Pepper's partner Blue. I don't remember if Blue actually showed up in the first book or not, but he's a major character here, and they are trying their best to help her adjust. This is a really fascinating sort of exploration of self and identity, because Cedra does not feel that the body kit is her in the same way that organic sapients feel instinctively like our bodies are ourselves. So in all of the narration of her chapters, she talks about, instead of shaking her head, it'll say she shook the kit's head. Or instead of saying that she's sitting down, it will say that she is sitting the kit down. And this idea of identity and being able to claim one's identity and one's self ends up being a theme that runs through both of the storylines. There's also inherently more of an exploration of AI rights in this book than there was in the first book. It was a major theme in the first book, but it's a little more immediate here. Of course, other people in this world can question whether an AI like Sidra is a person, but when you're reading a point of view chapter from her perspective, you can't question that. That's indisputable. And then the other story follows Pepper's childhood. And we meet her when she's a little girl in a factory on a sort of dystopian planet. She's known as Jane 23, and she knows absolutely nothing about the world outside of this factory where she and the other Janes sort and fix broken machine parts. Eventually, she gets an unusual opportunity to escape, and she takes it, and she finds herself outside on this sort of trashed junk side of this planet. It's basically a giant landfill with these factories that are meant to process all the junk. And it turns out that the other side of this planet is where people live in prosperity. And like Sidra, Jane is basically a new soul of sorts who knows absolutely nothing. And has to learn everything. And this is a survival story of Jane trying to survive in this desolate wasteland. She is taken in by the AI of a crashed ship, who tries to teach her what she needs to know in order to survive outside the factory and eventually get off planet. So it all comes full circle with Jane being introduced to the world by this AI named Owl, and then later as Pepper, being the person who's trying to help Sidra find her way. This is not a sci-fi book that you read for action. There's basically no action adventure in this book. This is a character study, and it's a thoughtful one, and it's a heartwarming one. There is at the end like kind of the absolute tamest museum heist you can possibly imagine. It happens without any big action. And I really enjoy sci-fi and fantasy stories that can get by on their characters and their ideas without relying on those action sequences. I found this just so incredibly heartwarming, and I loved it. I still gave this 4 stars, which is the same rating that I gave to The Long Way to a Small Angry Planet, but I think that A Closed and Common Orbit was possibly a little more to my taste, my personal taste, than the first book was. It also seemed like it was a little more polished in its writing. I attribute this to the fact that it's a second book, whereas The Long Way to a Small Angry Planet was a debut. And then the last book I have here to talk about is The Obelisk Gate by N.K. Jemisin. This is, of course, the second book in the Broken Earth trilogy, and the last one that's currently been released. The third book will be coming out in August, I think. And it follows the events of the 5th season. This one has 2 narrative threads instead of 3. We're following Essen, and then we're also following her daughter Nassun. And unlike the first book, these 2 narrative threads are taking place approximately concurrently. I think we have to backtrack a bit in Nassun's storyline to catch up to where we are with Essen. But basically, this is progressing forward chronologically. I think compared to the first book, this one is more technical in its approach. It's more about the magic system as it is. There's a lot about sort of learning magic and a lot about unlearning received methods of thinking about it in order to learn new things. There's also a lot in this about the Stone Eaters who are introduced in the first book, but you don't learn much about them. So this book felt a lot to me like it was just starting to fill in all of the necessary gaps, all of the questions that the first book left so utterly unanswered. So it's definitely a really necessary step in the progression of this series, but it's a lot less sort of sweeping and exciting than diving into this world for the first time was with the 5th season. In Essen's storyline, we follow the politics and disputes of the calm the community that she's ended up in at the end of the first book. It's a really unusual community that obeys really different rules from those expected in this world. And of course, the great season that has begun is threatening absolutely everything. Meanwhile, Eowyn is grappling with relearning things about her own power, and discovering what the intent of the obelisks might be. Meanwhile, Nassen's storyline is, I think, a little more personally compelling in this one. What I found really interesting about her is that her story in this book is one of dramatic shifts in how she sees both of her parents. Both Eowyn, who is absent from her life at this time, and Jija, her father, who has taken her away and whose ugly side she's really beginning to see. And there's this series of moments for her over the course of this book where she really grows up and stops seeing her parents as she has seen them as a child and begins seeing them for the flawed people they really are. In addition to the Stone Eaters, Nassen's storyline focuses more on the Guardians, who are another one of the things that are sort of mystery from the first book. We know that the Fulcrum-trained Imperial Origins were answerable to Guardians, although what and who the Guardians really are and who they're answerable to is something no one knows. Nassen finds herself in the company of some rogue Guardians, and she seems to be getting closer to uncovering some of their secrets. So yeah, I didn't find this as explosively exciting as reading the 5th season, but I thought it was still really well written, really well constructed, and it's probably a very good bridge to whatever's going to happen in book 3. And I gave it 4 stars. I should mention that this was one of the nominees for the Booktube SFF Awards, and I was participating in the read-along over in that Goodreads group for this book. Anyhow, those were the last 4 books I read in May. Let me know if you've read any of them, what you think. Anyhow, I hope you're having a very nice day. Bye for now.